She arrived in a convoy of black luxury cars, wearing a coat that cost more than his entire garage. He was covered in grease, eating a cold sandwich, while his 9-year-old daughter slept on a folding chair behind him. Vanessa Sinclair, billionaire CEO of one of the most powerful automotive companies on earth, stood at the entrance of his broken-down shop and said 3 words she had never said to anyone in her life. "I need you." Mason Reed didn't even look up from the engine block. He just said, "I know." If you want to know how a forgotten mechanic brought a billion-dollar empire back from the edge of total collapse, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The first thing Mason Reed did every Monday morning, before coffee, before the news, before anything, was stand at the window of his garage and watch the road. Not because he was hopeful, because he was calculating. The tow truck from Blackstone Motors usually showed up somewhere between 7 and 7:30. If it was early, that meant a straightforward job. A seized cylinder, maybe a cracked manifold, something he could turn around in 2 days and bill at his standard rate. If it was late, that meant trouble. Late meant the delivery driver had already stopped at 2 other mechanics first, been turned away, and was now pulling into Mason's lot as a last resort. Late meant a job nobody else would touch. And over the course of 10 years, Mason Reed had become the man you called when nobody else would touch it. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine on the workbench, a beat-up Mr. Coffee from 2009 that he'd rewired himself after the heating element burned out, and stood at the window in his undershirt, watching the fog sit low over the road that ran past his property. Brookhaven was quiet this early. The gas station across the street wasn't open yet. The diner 2 blocks down had its lights on, but the parking lot was empty. The clock on the wall said 6:58. Behind him, in the small room he'd converted from a storage closet into something resembling a living space, he could hear Chloe moving around, drawers opening and closing, the particular thump of sneakers on the floor that meant she was getting dressed for school. He'd already packed her lunch the night before, so turkey and cheese, apple slices, a small bag of pretzels, because she'd recently decided she didn't like chips anymore. There was a note folded inside the paper bag that said, "You're going to have a great Tuesday, kid." He wrote her a note every day, even though she'd never once told him whether she read them. He assumed she did. He kept writing them anyway. The thing about Mason Reed was that he wasn't dramatic about his life. He didn't sit around cataloging his hardships or measuring them against other people's. He'd had a rough 10 years. He knew that. His wife, Laura, had died of a brain aneurysm 6 weeks after Chloe turned 3. And the thing about that kind of loss, the sudden, without warning kind, is that it doesn't prepare you for anything. It just deposits you somewhere unfamiliar and leaves you there to figure out where you are. He'd been a junior engineer at Blackstone Motors then, a real job, with benefits and a parking pass and a desk in a building that had central air conditioning. He'd been 32 months away from vesting in the company pension. He had a 5-year plan. He had a dry erase board in his office with quarterly goals written on it in green marker. Laura died on a Wednesday in March. By October of the same year, Blackstone Motors announced a structural realignment of engineering talent, which was corporate language for laying off roughly 400 mid-level employees whose salaries were collectively inconvenient. Mason's name was on the list. His manager, a man named Gerald, who wore the same gray fleece every single day, delivered the news over a conference call rather than in person. "We really value your contributions," Gerald had said. Mason had held the phone against his ear and thought about Chloe, who was at daycare and probably, at that exact moment, trying to eat a crayon. He hadn't said anything back to Gerald. He'd just hung up. The garage had been his father's, a 2-bay shop with a hydraulic lift that still worked if you knew exactly how to coax it, a part shelving system that his father had built from mismatched lumber, and a reputation in the neighborhood as the place where people brought machines that were almost dead. His father had a gift for it, a patience with broken things that Mason had inherited without fully realizing it. When everything else fell apart, the garage was what remained. He moved Chloe's crib into the back room. He cleared out his father's old tools and organized them by function. He called in 2 favors from former colleagues who were still at Blackstone and quietly let it be known that he was available for independent contract work. Off the books, fast turnaround, reasonable rates. The Blackstone contract had started almost accidentally. One of those former colleagues, a supply chain manager named Rafe, who felt genuinely guilty about what had happened, had quietly routed a difficult warranty repair job to Mason's garage when the company's preferred contractors couldn't solve it. Mason had fixed the problem in 11 hours. The contractor that had spent 3 days failing to fix it had billed Blackstone $40,000. Mason billed them $6,000. Word traveled the way it does in organizations where budgets are tight and results are what matter. Within 8 months, a significant portion of Blackstone's most problematic engine repair work was being quietly redirected to a single-bay garage at the edge of Brookhaven, handled by a man nobody at corporate headquarters had ever met, and most of them had actively forgotten. The tow truck came every Monday morning. Mason fixed what arrived. That was the arrangement. Wyatt, Dad. Chloe appeared in the doorway between the living space and the garage, wearing her school uniform, dark navy pants, a white polo shirt with a small stain near the collar that hadn't come out in the wash, and carrying her backpack over one shoulder. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and Mason's habit of squinting when she was thinking hard about something. "Bus is at 7:15, she said. Not as a reminder, as information. Chloe had long since stopped needing reminders. "I know," Mason said. "Did you sleep?" "A little." She looked at him with the expression she'd been giving him since she was about 6, the one that said she didn't entirely believe him, but wasn't going to push it. She crossed the garage to the mini-fridge plugged in near the parts shelving and took out the lunch bag he'd packed. She looked inside it. She found the note. She read it, folded it back up, put it in her jacket pocket. She didn't say anything about it, but she put it in her pocket, which Mason had decided long ago was enough. "Truck coming today?" she asked. "Should be." "Same engine as last time?" "Different engine." She nodded like this was a meaningful distinction, which in fairness it was. She'd been listening to him talk about engines since before she could fully form sentences, and she understood more about the inside of a combustion system than most adults twice her age. "I'll be at Delia's after school," she said. "Her mom's dropping me off by 6. Call me when you leave there." "I always call you." "I know. Call me anyway." She gave him the look again. Then she shouldered her backpack and walked out through the side door, and Mason stood at the window and watched her cross the lot to the road and wait at the bus stop. The fog was starting to thin. The clock said 7:06. He went back to his coffee. Asa. The Monday in question, the one that would split his life into a before and after he hadn't anticipated, started like every other one. He had 3 jobs already open on the floor. A diesel truck engine from a small logistics company that ran routes up and down the coast, a motorcycle engine he was doing as a cash favor for a neighbor, and the half-disassembled carcass of a 1968 Ford Mustang that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Harold who'd been restoring the car for 11 years and had finally accepted he needed professional help. The Mustang was the most interesting. Harold didn't have money. The payment was structured as a series of small installments over 8 months. But the car itself was beautiful in the way only genuinely old machines are beautiful, with a history of being worked on badly by many different sets of hands over many decades. Diagnosing it was like reading a journal of everyone who'd ever touched it. Mason could tell, for instance, that someone in the early 90s had replaced the carburetor with one that was almost but not quite the correct fit. Someone else, probably in the early 2000s, had done a valve job and done it reasonably well, but used bolts that were a half size off from specification. A third person, more recently, based on the oxidation patterns, had replaced the exhaust manifold and managed to crack the passenger side gasket in the process. He found this sort of thing genuinely interesting. He always had. Laura used to say he approached every broken machine like it was a story he wanted to finish. He told her that was probably accurate. By 9 in the morning, the Blackstone tow truck still hadn't come. This wasn't unprecedented. Occasionally they ran late, a driver called out sick, a pickup ran long. Mason kept working. He finished the diagnostic on the diesel truck and wrote up his findings, a 2-page breakdown with parts numbers and labor estimates. He answered 2 emails. He called the supplier who was holding a back-ordered alternator and argued politely but persistently about the delivery timeline until the man on the other end agreed to overnight it. By 10:30, he found himself checking the window more than he usually did. By noon, something in his chest had started doing a calculation he didn't want it to do. He called the number he had on file for Blackstone's logistics department, A direct line that went to a dispatcher named Dale, who he'd spoken to dozens of times and who he was fairly certain had never once connected a name or face to the garage. The phone rang 11 times. Nobody answered. He tried the general contractor services number. He got an automated menu that directed him through 4 options before depositing him in a voicemail box that identified itself as belonging to the vendor engagement team. He left a message. It was the kind of message he'd gotten good at over the years. Polite, specific, no emotional leakage. He ate lunch at his workbench, a peanut butter sandwich and a cup of soup heated on the single electric burner he kept next to the parts washer. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he understood. Not completely. He didn't have confirmation, didn't have any official communication, but in the way you understand something when your gut has already processed the evidence and is simply waiting for your brain to catch up, he understood that the tow truck wasn't coming. Not today. Maybe not ever. He sat on the stool at his workbench for a while and looked at the garage. Harold's Mustang, the diesel truck, the motorcycle. 3 jobs in progress that totaled maybe $4,000 in combined revenue when finished. He thought about the utility bill sitting on top of the refrigerator in the back room. He thought about Chloe's school shoes, which she'd mentioned twice in the past month were getting tight. He picked up his coffee, found it was cold, and drank it anyway. Mom? That evening, after Delia's mother dropped Chloe off, and she'd eaten dinner and done her homework at the kitchen table, multiplication tables, and a worksheet about the water cycle, Mason sat in the garage alone after she'd gone to bed and went over the numbers. The Blackstone contract accounted for roughly 60% of his monthly revenue. He had 3 months of savings that could cover basic expenses if he was careful. He had 3 active clients who weren't Blackstone. He had a reputation in the local area that was solid but not wide. Most people in Brookhaven still took their cars to one of the chain service centers on Route 9. He had a 9-year-old daughter asleep in the room behind him. He got out a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything he could do. More local advertising. Approach the logistics companies that ran out of the industrial park on the south side of town. Reach out to the 2 auto dealerships in the area about warranty work. Call Rafe, assuming Rafe still answered, and see whether there was any other contract work to be had. He wrote for a while. The garage was cold. He had a space heater, but it was positioned to blow toward the work area, not toward the desk. He didn't move it. He kept writing. The rain started just before midnight. Mason knew this because he was still in the garage, still awake, having transitioned from the legal pad to the actual physical work of the Mustang, because doing something with his hands helped him think, and thinking was what he needed to do. He was on his back under the car, working by the beam of a shop light clipped to the undercarriage when he heard it. Tires on wet pavement. Not one set of tires, multiple. He slid out from under the car and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked out through the dirty window at the front of the garage. The road in front of his property was full of black cars, not the kind of black cars that meant anything good. In Mason's experience, not police, not emergency services. These were the kind of black cars that cost more than some houses. 3 of them, and behind them what looked like a 4th vehicle, a large SUV with tinted windows. They moved in a tight convoy and turned, all 4 of them, into his lot with a precision that suggested someone had planned the route. Mason stood in the middle of his garage with a shop rag in one hand and watched through the window. The convoy stopped. Nobody got out for a moment. Then, the back door of the second car opened, and a woman stepped out onto the wet asphalt in heels that were completely wrong for a rainy night in a garage lot. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30, wearing a dark coat, her hair pulled back, standing in the rain and looking at the front of his shop with an expression that Mason couldn't fully read from this distance. He knew who she was. Everyone in the automotive world knew who Vanessa Sinclair was. He'd seen her on the cover of 3 different trade magazines in the past 2 years. She'd been on the news during the congressional testimony about the recall hearings, sitting at the table in a gray suit, answering questions with the kind of precise, measured composure that either meant she was brilliant or she'd rehearsed for a week. Possibly both. She was the CEO of the company that had employed him, discarded him, and then quietly used his work for a decade without ever once picking up the phone to say his name. She was standing in the rain outside his garage at 12:20 in the morning. He went back to the car. He was under the Mustang, back on his shop light, when he heard the side door of the garage open. He heard footsteps, the sound of good shoes on concrete, someone walking carefully and not finding good footing, and then he heard her voice. "Mr. Reed." He didn't answer immediately. He finished tightening the bolt he had his hand on, gave it one more quarter turn, and then slid out from under the car. Vanessa Sinclair was standing 10 feet away from him, and she looked, this was the thing he noticed before anything else, exhausted. The composure was there. It was professional-grade composure, the kind that costs something to maintain, but underneath it, she looked like a person who had been awake for a very long time and was running on a combination of caffeine and accumulated desperation. Her coat was spotted with rain. Her shoes were not appropriate for this floor. There were two men standing just inside the door behind her. Security, he assumed, though they were doing a decent job of looking like they weren't, and a third person, a woman in her 40s with a tablet computer, standing off to the side. "Mr. Reed," Vanessa said again. I know who you are," Mason said. He said it without heat, just as a fact. She absorbed this. "Then you know why—" "I don't, actually." He pulled a clean rag from the hook above the workbench and started wiping his hands. "I have some guesses, but I don't know." She looked at him for a moment. Around them, the garage, the flickering overhead fluorescent, the half-disassembled cars, the organized chaos of 10 years of independent work, was doing what garages do when something expensive and out of place enters them. It was making the out-of-place thing visible. "The Meridian platform," she said. He nodded slowly. He had heard about the Meridian. Every independent mechanic in the country who worked on Blackstone engines had heard about the Meridian, the new flagship engine architecture that was supposed to be the future of the company's performance line. It had been in development for 4 years. It had been announced at an industry event in Detroit 3 months ago with significant fanfare. "Failed?" he asked. "Catastrophically," she said. The word came out with a precision that suggested she'd been saying it to people in boardrooms for several days and had stripped all the emotion out of it through repetition. "Not one engine, the entire platform. The failure mode is systemic. We can't manufacture around it. We can't patch it in software. The fundamental architecture is compromised." "What kind of timeline are you looking at?" "If we don't resolve this in 30 days, we're looking at a full production halt. The recall cost alone—" She stopped. She seemed to make a decision. "We're already in breach of 3 supplier contracts. 2 of our largest institutional investors are in emergency meetings as we speak. If the market opens Monday with no credible resolution plan—" She didn't finish that sentence either. Mason set down the rag. He looked at her, this 30-year-old woman who ran a company that employed 40,000 people and who had driven to his garage in the rain at midnight and was choosing her words the way people choose their words when they're trying not to sound like they're begging. "You came here because your internal team can't fix it," he said. "My internal team has been working on it for 8 days. And they can't fix it." A pause. "No. And someone pointed out that for the past 10 years, every major engine failure your company had privately written off as unfixable was eventually resolved by work done in this garage." She didn't answer that directly. What she said was, "I should have known about you a long time ago. That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's something I have to be honest about. What happened, how your work was used without proper acknowledgement, that was wrong. I'm not going to stand here and explain it away." Mason looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the layoff call with Gerald and his gray fleece. He thought about the tow truck that hadn't come today. He thought about the utility bill on the refrigerator. He thought about Chloe in the room behind the wall to his left, asleep with her homework finished and her shoes that were getting too tight. "What's the Meridian failing at specifically?" he asked. Something shifted in Vanessa Sinclair's face, almost imperceptible, a micro-expression of relief she was trying to contain. "The thermal management system. The cooling architecture is generating stress fractures in the block under sustained load. We can reproduce the failure in testing in under 4 hours." 4 hours, Mason repeated. "That's fast. Too fast, yes. You have the engineering documentation with you?" She looked back at the woman with the tablet, who stepped forward and held the device out toward Mason. On the screen were schematics. He took the tablet, scrolled through the first few pages, and felt the specific mental click of someone who has spent their whole life learning a particular language, finally encountering a text in that language. He scrolled for a minute. He handed the tablet back. I need to see the actual engine, he said. Not photos, not specs. The engine. We can have one here by 6 a.m. I start work at 7. He looked at her. I need my rate in writing before I touch anything. I need full access to your engineering documentation, all of it, including whatever your team's already tried. And I need to be able to work the way I work, which means my process, my timeline, my judgment calls. Agreed, she said, without hesitating. He nodded once. There's a cot in the back if you need somewhere to wait, he said. Coffee machine's on the bench. It's bad coffee, but it works. Vanessa Sinclair, CEO of Blackstone Motors, one of the youngest billionaires in the automotive industry, a person accustomed to the full machinery of executive hospitality, looked at the ancient Mr. Coffee on the workbench for a moment. Thank you, she said. Mason went back to Harold's Mustang. He had 3 more hours of work left on it, and he'd told Harold he'd call him with an update in the morning. And Harold was 81 years old and had been waiting 11 years for this car to run again. Some things didn't change just because a billionaire showed up. At 5:45 in the morning, Chloe came out of the back room in her pajamas and found 3 strangers in the garage. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at Vanessa, who was sitting on a folding chair near the workbench, coat still on, the tablet in her lap, the coffee cup from the Mr. Coffee untouched beside her. She looked at the 2 security men, who were standing very still near the door. She looked at the woman with the tablet. Then she looked at her father, who was washing his hands at the utility sink. Who are they? Chloe asked. Someone who needs help with an engine, Mason said. Chloe looked at Vanessa again. Vanessa looked back. There was a brief, unscripted silence. Is it a bad engine? Chloe asked. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. Something in her face shifted from the practiced executive composure into something less rehearsed. Yes, she said. Very bad. Chloe considered this with the gravity of a person who had grown up around bad engines and understood this was not a trivial matter. My dad can fix it, she said. And then she went to the mini fridge to get her lunch bag and start getting ready for school. At 6:17 in the morning, while Mason was on the phone with his parts supplier, Vanessa stepped outside to make her own calls. He watched her through the window, standing in the gray early light, the rain gone now, the lot wet and quiet, speaking into her phone with short, direct sentences. She looked different outside the context of the boardroom photographs. Younger. She moved with the slightly over-controlled energy of someone trying very hard to look like they weren't afraid. He recognized it. He'd moved like that himself for about a year after Laura died. He went back to his phone call. At 6:55, a flatbed truck turned into the lot carrying a crated Meridian engine block, and Mason Reed set down his coffee and walked out to meet it. He stood next to the truck and looked at the crate for a moment. 40,000 jobs. A company that had used him and discarded him and then come to him when everything fell apart. A 9-year-old girl asleep 20 feet behind him who thought he could fix anything. He started unbuckling the crate. There was work to do. The Meridian engine was, objectively, a beautiful piece of engineering. That was the first thing Mason thought when they uncrated it, and he got his hands on it for the first time. Not the failure modes, not the recall liability, not the 40,000 jobs hanging in the background like a weather system, just the object itself. The Meridian E7 platform had been designed by a team of 200 engineers over 4 years, and you could feel the ambition in it, the way you can feel ambition in anything that was built by people who genuinely believed they were making something important. The architecture was elegant, the tolerances were tight, the machining on the block was some of the cleanest work Mason had seen come out of Blackstone in a decade, which made the failure more interesting, not less. Because the problem with elegant systems, Mason had learned this through 10 years of fixing other people's elegant systems, is that elegance and durability are not the same thing. Beautiful machines fail in beautiful ways. The more precisely everything fits together, the less room there is for the small imperfections that real-world operating conditions are constantly generating. And real-world operating conditions, in Mason's experience, were always generating small imperfections. He spent the first 2 hours doing nothing but looking. Vanessa's team had sent a liaison with the engine, a young engineer named Patrick, who introduced himself with the specific combination of exhaustion and nervous energy that suggested he hadn't slept in several days and had been told by someone with authority over his career not to mess this up. Patrick was maybe 26. He had a laptop bag over one shoulder and a folder of printed schematics under his arm, and the expression of a man who had been briefed extensively but still wasn't sure what he was walking into. "We've already run the thermal modeling twice," Patrick said, about 15 minutes in, while Mason was crouched next to the engine block with a flashlight and his reading glasses. "The simulation shows the failure initiating in the—" "I know where the simulation shows it," Mason said. "I read the documentation last night." "Right, so we think if we modify the, Patrick?" Mason looked up at him. "I need quiet for a bit." Patrick went quiet. He was quiet for almost 20 minutes, which Mason appreciated, because in his experience, engineers who couldn't stay quiet while someone else was looking at a problem were engineers who'd already decided they knew the answer and were just waiting for confirmation. Patrick held his quiet, which suggested he was at least somewhat open to the possibility that the answer was still unknown. Mason stood up. He walked around the engine twice. He crouched down on the other side. He put his hand flat on the top of the block. Not for any diagnostic reason, just habit, the way some people touch the hood of a car without thinking about it. "How long has your team known about the fracture pattern?" he asked. Patrick hesitated. "Officially, 8 days. Unofficially?" Another pause. "Some of us have had concerns about the thermal architecture for longer than that." Mason looked at him. "How much longer?" Patrick shifted his weight. "I flagged something in a design review about 14 months ago. I wasn't certain. It was a concern, not a definitive finding, and the team lead at the time felt the simulation data was sufficient to move forward. And you didn't push it. It wasn't a question." Patrick knew it wasn't a question. He adjusted the strap of his laptop bag and looked somewhere slightly to the left of Mason's face. "The launch timeline was aggressive," he said. "There was pressure to—" "I know about launch pressure," Mason said. He straightened up and took off his reading glasses. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm just trying to understand when the problem actually started, because where it started and where it's expressing itself right now are probably two different places, and if your team has spent 8 days treating the expression point as the origin point, that would explain why you haven't fixed it." Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, Yes, that's essentially what I've been trying to say internally for the past week. But I'm a junior associate engineer. There are people on this project who've been building engines since before I was born. And they've been wrong before? Yeah, obviously, everyone has. Right. Mason put his glasses in his shirt pocket. "Pull up your thermal gradient data from the testing cycle. All of it. Not the summary report, the raw numbers. I want to see what the temperature distribution looks like across the block in the first 30 minutes of load." Patrick opened his laptop. They got to work. Vanessa had not gone back to the hotel. She'd told herself she would. There was a room at the Westin 20 minutes away, and her assistant Diane had already confirmed the reservation and left a wake-up call and laid out a fresh change of clothes for the morning, because Diane operated with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 6 years managing the life of a person who routinely forgot to perform basic human maintenance. But she hadn't gone. She'd sat in the folding chair near Mason's workbench, and then she'd stood near the door, and then she'd sat again. And around 4 in the morning, she'd realized she wasn't actually capable of leaving yet. Not until she understood what was happening. Not until she saw how he worked. She told herself it was due diligence. She watched him with Patrick for 3 hours before she was honest enough with herself to stop calling it that. The thing about watching Mason Reed work was that it was quiet in a way that high-functioning competence rarely was, in Vanessa's experience. She'd built an empire by surrounding herself with extremely capable, extremely loud people. People who led with their conclusions, who used data as ammunition, who filled every available silence with the sound of their own thinking. She'd become one of those people herself. The boardroom was a performance space, and you survived it by performing. Mason didn't perform. He asked short, direct questions. He listened to the answers without interrupting. When something surprised him, his expression changed slightly, and he'd pause for a few seconds, and then go somewhere else with his line of inquiry, like a man following a sound through a building rather than working from a map. At one point, Patrick showed him a data visualization, a thermal gradient rendering that one of Blackstone's senior engineers had spent 2 days building, a genuinely impressive piece of analysis work. and Mason looked at it for about 10 seconds and said, "That's the wrong layer." Patrick blinked. "What?" "The visualization is showing you the surface temperature distribution, but the fracture isn't initiating at the surface. It's initiating in the middle section of the block, between the water jacket and the cylinder wall. You're measuring the wrong thing." Patrick looked at the visualization. He looked at Mason. "How do you—" "Because the fracture pattern on this block," Mason put his finger on a specific point on the engine, "this is where it's expressing. But look at the surface geometry here. The surface is cooler than the surrounding material. If the origin were at the surface, you'd have the opposite pattern. You'd have heat concentration at the origin, not dissipation. So the heat is traveling outward from somewhere deeper, and the fracture is following it." Patrick stared at the engine for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Oh." And then even more quietly, "Oh, we've been running all our diagnostics at the wrong depth." "Probably," Mason said. "I want to confirm it before I say definitely." He went back to looking at the block. Vanessa leaned against the doorframe of the garage with her cold cup of bad coffee and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time and couldn't immediately name. It took her until Chloe came out in her pajamas that morning to understand what it was. It was the particular feeling of watching someone be genuinely good at something. Not strategically good, not competitively good, but good in the way that comes from 10,000 hours of paying attention to a thing because the thing itself is interesting. Laura used to say Mason approached every broken machine like it was a story he wanted to finish. Vanessa hadn't known Laura. She didn't know that, but she could see it. By the time Chloe's school bus came and went and the morning settled into the gray, ordinary light of a Tuesday in Brookhaven, Mason had identified 3 separate contributing factors to the Meridian's failure. And the look on Patrick's face had graduated from nervous exhaustion to the specific wide-eyed alertness of someone who has been awake too long and is suddenly, genuinely engaged. "The thermal management architecture is the root," Mason said, pulling a yellow legal pad toward himself and starting to sketch. His handwriting was not beautiful, large, angled letters, more fast than neat, but the sketches were precise in the way that mattered, the proportional relationships correct, even when the representation was rough. But it's being compounded by 2 secondary issues. First, the oil gallery routing here creates a pressure differential under sustained load that's essentially fighting the cooling system. They're working at cross purposes. "That wasn't flagged in the original design review," Patrick said. "No, because in isolation, both systems function correctly. The problem only emerges when they're operating simultaneously under specific load conditions. What are the parameters of the failure testing you've been running?" Patrick looked at his laptop. "Sustained load at 60% capacity, 2-hour cycle." "What's the real-world use profile for this engine?" A pause. "The primary application is high-performance commercial vehicles. Sustained highway operation, heavy load, 4 to 6 hours per cycle." Mason set down his pencil. He looked at Patrick. Patrick had the expression of a man doing math in his head and not liking the result. "You've been testing at 60%, Mason said. "Yes." "And the vehicle is designed to operate under heavy load for 4 to 6 hours. "Yes." "So you've been testing at the wrong capacity for the wrong duration." The silence in the garage was not a comfortable one. Somewhere in the distance, a truck went past on the road outside. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, the way it always did. "How long," Patrick said slowly, "would you estimate the failure initiates under real-world operating conditions?" "Based on what I'm seeing here," Mason picked up his pencil again, 90 minutes. Maybe less. With a heavy payload on a sustained grade. He paused. "Has this engine shipped in any commercial units yet?" Patrick looked for a moment like a man who had just remembered something he would very much prefer not to have remembered. He looked at his laptop. He looked at Mason. He looked at Vanessa, who was now standing in the center of the garage rather than the doorway, her phone in her hand. 14 pre-production units, he said. Field validation fleet. They've been in operation for... He checked the laptop. 11 days. The 3 of them looked at each other. Vanessa had her phone to her ear before Patrick finished the sentence. The next 4 hours were the loudest the garage had been in Mason's memory. Vanessa ran the recall coordination from his workbench. because the workbench had the best cell reception, and because she seemed, by this point, to have simply stopped thinking of the garage as an unusual place to operate from. She made 12 calls in 90 minutes. Mason gathered later from fragments he overheard that the field validation fleet was pulled from operation within 3 hours. All 14 vehicles, located and stopped through a combination of GPS tracking and increasingly urgent phone calls to the fleet operators. Nobody argued. When the CEO calls directly, people do not argue. The two security men who'd come with the convoy took turns pacing near the door and checking their phones. The woman with the tablet, whose name turned out to be Diane, sat on the cot in the back room with her laptop and handled whatever Vanessa couldn't handle directly, with a speed and precision that Mason respected. Through all of it, Patrick sat at Mason's workbench, and the two of them kept working. Because the field crisis was Vanessa's problem to manage. The actual problem, the engine, was still Mason's. "Okay," Mason said, somewhere around noon, when the recall coordination had moved from emergency to managed and the ambient noise level had dropped enough to think. "I want to talk about the fix." Patrick looked up from his laptop. He had dark circles under his eyes that had been present since he arrived, and had deepened over the course of the morning to something that was approaching geological. "You have one? I have the beginning of one." Mason turned the legal pad to show him. "The thermal management issue is fixable with a redesigned coolant routing, here and here. It's not a small change, but it's an engineering change, not a fundamental architecture change. The oil gallery routing issue is actually simpler than it looks. The pressure differential is a consequence of the gallery diameter at this junction. If you increase the diameter by 3 millimeters and reposition the relief valve, the systems stop fighting each other." Patrick leaned over the sketch. He studied it for a long moment. This is weeks of detailed engineering work to validate and implement." "Yes." "And the tooling changes alone for the coolant routing redesign will take time." "Yes." Mason sat back. "I'm telling you what the problem is and what direction the fix goes in. I'm not telling you I can manufacture a solution by Thursday. Nobody can do that. Anyone who tells you they can is lying to you." Patrick exhaled. "That's not going to be a popular thing to tell the board." "Probably not. Ms. Sinclair was expecting—" "I know what she was expecting," Mason said. "She was expecting a miracle because her company is in crisis, and miracles are what desperate people want. But what I can give her is better than a miracle, because it's real. I can tell her exactly what's wrong. I can tell her the precise engineering path to fix it, and I can tell her the minimum viable timeline to do it right. That's worth more than someone telling her it'll be fine by next week and then being wrong." Patrick looked at him. There was something in his expression that Mason couldn't quite read, a mix of respect and something that might have been relief, the particular relief of a young person who has spent a long time in an environment where the truth was negotiable and has just encountered someone for whom it isn't. "Yeah," Patrick said. "Okay." "The third issue," Mason continued, "is the one nobody on your team has found yet." Patrick straightened. "What's the third issue?" Mason turned back to the engine block. He took his flashlight and positioned it at a low angle against the block's surface, creating a raking light that made the surface geometry cast shadows. "Come look at this." Patrick came around the table and crouched next to him. "The casting," Mason said, moving the flashlight slowly. "Right here. You see that?" Patrick squinted. "That looks like a surface variation. That could be within tolerance." "It's within the tolerance specified in the design documentation," Mason agreed, "but it shouldn't be within tolerance. That surface variation at this specific location on the block is in the load path between the cylinder wall and the lower block web. Under thermal expansion, this variation creates a contact stress concentration that accelerates the fracture. So the tolerance specification is wrong. The tolerance specification was written by someone who didn't account for the combined loading conditions," Mason said, "which is probably because the testing protocol didn't replicate the combined loading conditions." Patrick sat back on his heels. He looked at the block. He looked at Mason. "You found that from a flashlight. And 10 years of looking at how things fail," Mason said. He stood up. His back made a noise that it had been making more frequently lately, the kind of noise that suggested his body had opinions about the amount of time he spent crouching on concrete floors. It's not magic, it's just pattern recognition. You see enough failures, you start to know where to look. Our senior engineers have looked at this engine for 8 days. I know. And you've had it for, Patrick checked his phone, 7 hours. I'm not trying to make anyone look bad, Mason said. Your engineers are good. They were looking at the right problem with the wrong assumptions. That happens. He put his glasses back on and picked up the legal pad. Now help me work out the load model for the redesigned coolant routing. At 2 in the afternoon, Vanessa came back to the workbench. She'd been on calls in the parking lot and in the back room and at various points just pacing near the hydraulic lift, her voice controlled but her pace not. Now she stood beside Mason's stool and waited for a pause in what he and Patrick were doing. The fleet is secured, she said, all 14 units. Good, Mason said. I need to brief the board in 3 hours. She set her phone face down on the bench, which Mason had noticed people only did when they were trying to reduce the number of things demanding their attention simultaneously. What do I tell them? He looked at her. The truth or what they want to hear? The truth. Tell them the problem is identified. It's 3-part and it's fixable. Tell them the fix requires real engineering time. I'd say minimum 6 weeks for the coolant redesign to be validated and tooled, less for the oil gallery and casting tolerance corrections. Tell them the platform architecture is not fundamentally compromised, which I know is the question they're most afraid to ask. The Meridian can work. It just has to be built correctly. Vanessa absorbed this. 6 weeks is a long time in terms of investor confidence. I know. If I go into that call and say 6 weeks, at least 2 of the board members are going to push for an emergency pivot to the legacy platform. That would be a mistake, Mason said. The legacy platform is why you built the Meridian. The legacy platform has its own problems. It's just that they're familiar problems that nobody wants to pay to fix. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the legal pad sketches. Can I take these? I'll give you cleaner copies. He tore the top pages off the pad and started redrawing them. The same diagrams, slightly more organized with labels. His handwriting was still not beautiful, but the drawings were clear. He finished in about 8 minutes. He slid them across the bench to her. She picked them up and looked at them. She looked at them for longer than was strictly necessary to read them, and Mason had the sense that she was doing something else, processing something beyond the technical information, something that had been building over the course of the past several hours in this garage. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why did you agree to this? She set the drawings down. I showed up here at midnight. No notice. My company pushed you out during the worst period of your life, and you weren't. You just started working. Mason thought about this for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. You want the real answer or the nice one? Real. 40,000 people work for Blackstone, he said. Most of them don't have anything to do with what happened to me. They've got their own bills, and their own kids, and their own complications. And the Meridian failure, if it plays out the way it could play out, it's not just Blackstone. The supplier chain alone would take down maybe a dozen smaller companies. He paused. I can fix the problem. If I can fix a problem and I choose not to, then whatever happens next is partly my responsibility. I don't want that responsibility. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. There was something working behind her eyes that she wasn't saying. That's it? She asked. That's the whole reason? I also need the work, he said. My main contract just disappeared this morning. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face. It didn't fully arrive yet. She pulled it back, or maybe she was just too tired to let it land. But it was there for a second. We'll make the rate right, she said. I know you will. I put it in writing before I touched the engine. This time the smile made it. Brief, real, the kind that isn't planned. You did. Always get it in writing, Mason said. He turned back to the engine. Patrick left at 4 o'clock, driving back to Blackstone headquarters with the legal pad sketches, the raw thermal data that Mason had helped him reprocess, and a technical brief that the two of them had drafted jointly over the course of the afternoon. He shook Mason's hand at the door with the earnestness of a person who had just had a genuinely significant experience and didn't know how to compact it into a handshake. I'm going to credit you in the engineering report, Patrick said. You don't have to do that. I want to. Mason nodded. He didn't argue with it further because arguing felt like a version of false modesty. He wasn't interested in performing. He'd done the work. If Patrick wanted to say so, that was up to Patrick. The convoy of black cars had thinned over the course of the day. 2 of the security men had left around noon. Diane had left at 3, though she'd returned briefly to drop off a professional-looking document that turned out to be a formal engagement contract with a rate that caused Mason to look at it twice and then fold it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket rather than the stack of papers on the desk. By 5 in the afternoon, the garage was almost quiet again. Almost. Vanessa was still there. She was sitting in the folding chair near the workbench, the same chair she'd been in at 4 in the morning, which felt like about 3 days ago, with her phone in her lap and her coat off for the first time since she'd arrived. She had the look of someone who had just run a very long distance and was trying to decide whether they had enough left for whatever came next. Mason was cleaning tools. It was methodical work, the kind that didn't require thought, and he did it partly because it needed doing, and partly because, after a day of intense diagnostic work, his brain needed the equivalent of a few laps cooling down. "How did the board call go?" he asked. "About how I expected." She stretched her neck, a quick, unselfconscious movement that seemed to surprise even her, like her body had acted before her professional composure could stop it. "2 members want to pivot to legacy. The rest are willing to hold if I can give them a credible engineering timeline by end of week." "You'll have it by end of week." "You're sure?" "Patrick is good," Mason said. "He's been looking at the wrong thing, but now that he knows what the right thing is, he'll move fast. He's got that—" He searched for the word. "That particular energy where the problem is more interesting than the politics. That's useful." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "He flagged the thermal architecture concern 14 months ago," she said. "He told me. And nobody—" She stopped. "It went nowhere. It went the place inconvenient concerns go when there's a launch timeline and a revenue target attached," Mason said. He wasn't editorializing, just describing. Vanessa absorbed this with the expression of someone cataloging it for later use, specifically the uncomfortable kind of later use. "That's a systems failure," she said, "not just a technical one." "Usually is." She looked at him. "You're not surprised." "By what?" "Any of this. The cover-up, the timeline pressure, I used to work there," Mason said simply. The reminder landed between them without drama. Vanessa looked at her phone. She didn't look at it because anything had happened on it. She looked at it the way people look at objects when they need a moment before the next sentence. "I want to apologize," she said. Mason kept cleaning the wrench in his hands. "You already did that, last night." "I said it was wrong. That's not the same as apologizing." He set the wrench down. He looked at her. Vanessa Sinclair was looking back at him with the expression of a person who was not accustomed to this particular kind of exposure, the kind where there's no boardroom, no prepared remarks, no audience to perform for, just a garage, and someone who had a genuine reason to be angry. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I hear you." He picked up the next wrench. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine, because it wasn't fine. 10 years is a long time to be used without being seen, but you didn't make that decision, and you can't unmake it, so what matters now is what happens from here." He paused. "The contract terms are in that folder on the desk. If they're right, sign them. If they're not, tell me what needs to change. That's what from here looks like." Vanessa looked at the folder on the desk for a moment. She leaned forward and opened it. She read through the contract, actually read it, not the scan for red flags that executives typically performed. And she didn't say anything for a while. When she'd finished, she reached into her coat pocket for a pen. She signed it. She set it back on the desk. Mason finished with the wrench and moved on to the socket set. "My driver's outside," Vanessa said. She stood up. She picked up her coat. For a moment, she just stood in the middle of the garage looking at the space, the hydraulic lift, the shelving, Harold's half-restored Mustang, the walls with the organized tools and the handwritten parts order notes taped at eye level. Looking at it the way you look at a place when you're trying to understand what the place means. "It doesn't look like much," Mason said. "No," she agreed. "It looks like it works, though." She said goodnight. She walked to the door. She stopped with one hand on the frame and turned back with the look of someone who has just remembered something they weren't sure they were going to say. Chloe said you could fix it, Vanessa said. This morning, when she came out. I know. She sounded very certain. She usually is, Mason said. Vanessa nodded once. She left. Mason stood in the quiet garage and listened to the car pull out of the lot. He stood there for a minute. Then he went to the refrigerator in the back room and took out the leftover soup from last night's dinner and put it on the electric burner, because Chloe would be back from Delia's within the hour and she'd be hungry, and the most reliable thing in his life, more reliable than contracts, more reliable than tow trucks, more reliable than anything a billionaire could promise, was that a 9-year-old girl would come home expecting dinner. He stirred the soup. He thought about the Meridian. He thought about Patrick's face when he'd understood the problem. He thought about Vanessa standing in his garage at midnight in heels, looking like someone who hadn't built her life on the assumption that it could go wrong this fast. The soup started to steam. He got out 2 bowls. The engineering report landed on Vanessa's desk at 6:47 Wednesday morning, 17 hours after Patrick had driven out of Mason's lot, with the legal pad sketches and a technical brief that neither of them had fully slept before finishing. It was 43 pages. Vanessa read all of it before her assistant arrived, before the first scheduled call of the day, before the coffee that Diane placed on her desk at 7:15 had cooled enough to drink. She read it in the specific way she read documents that mattered, pen in hand, margin notes, occasionally stopping to read a paragraph twice when the implications required sitting with rather than moving past. On page 12, there was a section titled Root Cause Analysis, Primary Thermal Management Failure, that cited Mason Reed 11 times in 9 pages. Patrick had not been subtle about the attribution. The language was formal and technical, but the authorship was clear. The diagnostic framework, the load depth analysis, the identification of the surface variation in the casting tolerance, all of it was Mason's, and Patrick had said so in plain language. On page 31, in a section on recommended corrective action timelines, Patrick had written a single paragraph that Vanessa read 3 times. It is the assessment of this engineer that the Meridian E7 platform is architecturally sound and commercially viable with implementation of the recommended corrections. The failure modes identified are not indicative of fundamental design error, but rather of testing protocol gaps and compounded tolerance assumptions that are correctable through targeted engineering revision. This conclusion is based substantially on diagnostic work performed by independent contractor Mason Reed, whose analysis in a single operational session identified systemic issues that a team of 18 engineers had not located in 8 days of testing. Vanessa set down her pen. She looked at the page. 18 engineers, 8 days, 1 man, 7 hours. She picked up her pen and wrote in the margin, "Why didn't we know about him sooner?" Then she looked at what she'd written and felt the specific discomfort of asking a question she already knew the answer to. Because he wasn't in the building. Because the work came in through a logistics channel that nobody senior ever looked at. Because the company had quietly routed difficult repair work to his garage for a decade through a chain of informal decisions that nobody had ever assembled into a coherent picture of what was actually happening. The tow truck went every Monday. The engines came back fixed. The billing went through a vendor account managed by a department that had changed hands 3 times since the arrangement began. Nobody had connected the dots because nobody had been looking at all the dots simultaneously. And because, and this was the part that sat in Vanessa's chest in a way that was uncomfortable and accurate, the people who knew, or half knew, had found it professionally convenient not to ask too many questions. A repair bill of $6,000 instead of $40,000 raised no flags when the result was the same. It didn't generate paperwork or performance reviews or organizational restructuring. It just worked. Quietly, invisibly, in a garage at the edge of Brookhaven. She closed the report and picked up her phone. She drove to the garage herself that morning. Not the convoy, just the car, just her driver, no security detail. Diane had raised an eyebrow at this and said nothing, which was one of the things Vanessa valued most about Diane. Mason was on the phone when she arrived, standing outside the garage in the early morning cold with a cup of coffee, and she could tell from the way he was listening, that particular quality of attention, very still, weight slightly shifted, that it was not a business call. She waited near the car. He finished the call and came toward her with the expression of someone who had been expecting her but wasn't making a performance of it. "Patrick's report," she said. "He sent me a copy. It's good work. It's accurate work. That's more important." She almost smiled at that. "Not quite. I want you to come to Blackstone, not just as a consultant. I want you in the building, working with the engineering team on the Meridian corrections." Mason looked at her steadily. "For how long?" "For as long as it takes to get the platform right." "That could be 6 months." "It could be." He was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. Behind him, through the open garage door, she could hear the sound of something mechanical. Metal on metal, faint and rhythmic, which she had already begun to associate with the ambient sound of this place. "Chloe's school is here," he said. "I know. My clients are here. Harold, the diesel contracts. I'm not asking you to shut the garage down," Vanessa said. "I'm asking you to come to the plant 4 days a week. Whatever arrangement makes sense for your schedule." He looked at her. 4 days a week at your facility, in my schedule. Your terms, completely. He considered this with the methodical patience that she was already recognizing as characteristic of him, the way he considered everything. Like a man who had learned that decisions made in a hurry tended to have longer consequences than the hurry was worth. "I'll come 3 days a week," he said. "Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I need Monday for the garage and Friday for Chloe." "Done. And I drive myself. I don't need a car service." "Okay. And when I say something in a meeting, I need it to land the same way it would land if I had a VP title in a corner office. I'm not interested in being the outside consultant who gets listened to politely and then ignored." Vanessa held his gaze. "I'll make sure of that personally." He nodded once. "All right." "Just like that?" "I said all right, didn't I?" She almost smiled again. This time it made it further than before. The Blackstone Motors engineering facility outside the city was the kind of complex that existed in a different physical register than Mason's garage. 40 acres of precision manufacturing, glass and steel office buildings, a test track that curved around the back of the property like a gray river. Mason had seen pictures of it online years ago, during the period when he still occasionally looked up what had become of the company that had discarded him. He'd stopped doing that eventually. It hadn't been a conscious decision. Just one day he'd noticed he hadn't done it in a while, and he'd left it that way. He drove there Tuesday morning in his truck, a 12-year-old F-150 with 200,000 miles and a rebuilt transmission that he'd done himself, and parked in the visitor lot because nobody had told him where else to park. He sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. He'd worked in a building like this once. He'd had a badge and a desk and a parking pass and a 5-year plan written on a dry erase board. That had been a different version of him. He wasn't entirely sure which version was more accurate. He got out of the truck. Vanessa had arranged for Patrick to meet him at the entrance, which was a small logistical decision that Mason appreciated more than he let on, because walking into a building full of engineers who knew your name from a 43-page report but had never met you was a specific kind of uncomfortable that having a familiar face at the door reduced considerably. Patrick looked like he'd slept. Not enough, but some. He was wearing a slightly cleaner version of the same style of clothing as before. Khakis, a company-branded fleece, laptop bag, and he had the energy of someone operating on professional purpose, which was a considerable improvement from the nervous exhaustion of 2 days prior. "Good to see you," Patrick said, with the particular sincerity of someone who meant it literally. "You too," Mason said. The report was good. Patrick looked briefly like a person who had received a compliment they weren't sure they'd earned and was deciding whether to accept it. He accepted it. "I cited you a lot." "I noticed. Some people noticed that too." Mason looked at him. "What kind of people?" Patrick pushed open the door. "Come on, I'll take you to the team." The Meridian engineering team occupied a large open workspace on the second floor of the main engineering building. Rows of workstations, whiteboards covered in diagrams and calculations, a wall of monitors displaying thermal modeling simulations. There were 18 people in the room when Mason and Patrick entered, and the way the room shifted when he walked in told him exactly how the 43-page report had landed internally. Half the team was clearly expecting him with something like relief. Younger engineers mostly, people who had been on this project long enough to be frustrated, and who had read the root cause analysis the way you read a diagnosis after months of unexplained symptoms. He could see it in their posture, the slight lean toward rather than away. The other half was something more complicated. There were 3 senior engineers sitting at the far end of the room, and they had the particular stillness of people who have been told by someone with authority over their careers that an outside contractor has just identified in 7 hours what they failed to find in 8 days. That information had been absorbed, and it had not been absorbed comfortably. Mason recognized the look. He'd worn it himself once, early in his career, when a consultant twice his age had solved a problem in an afternoon that his team had been stuck on for 2 weeks. He'd hated the consultant, and then he'd paid attention to how the consultant thought, and it had made him a better engineer. He didn't know if the senior engineers in front of him would do the same. That was their business. He introduced himself briefly and without theater. He said his name, said he was there to work on the meridian corrections, and said he wanted to spend the morning looking at what the team had already attempted before forming any opinions about next steps. This was genuine. He'd meant it when he told Patrick that good engineers working with wrong assumptions were still good engineers, and the attempts they'd made over 8 days contained information he needed. One of the senior engineers, a man of about 50, with the compact wire-coiled energy of someone who had spent 30 years being the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered, said, "We've reviewed the root cause document." His name, Mason learned, was Carl Weiss. He had 3 patents, 12 years at Blackstone, and a reputation, Patrick had mentioned quietly on the way up the stairs, for being difficult in proportion to how much he felt his expertise was being questioned. "Good," Mason said. "What do you think?" Carl looked at him. It was a measuring look, the kind that was also a test, the kind that asked whether the person being looked at would flinch or hold. "I think the thermal gradient analysis is correct," Carl said, with the careful deliberateness of a man making a significant concession by quarters. "I think the oil gallery finding is also correct." "But," Mason said, "the casting tolerance issue?" Carl put his hands flat on the table. "I've been manufacturing engines for 30 years. That surface variation is within spec." "The spec is wrong for this application," Mason said. "The spec is industry standard. The industry standard wasn't written for this specific load path geometry. The Meridian isn't a standard engine. That's the entire point of it." Mason moved to the nearest whiteboard and picked up a marker. "Can I?" Carl made a gesture that was not quite a nod, but was close enough. Mason drew the cross-section, the cylinder wall, the lower block web, the point of the surface variation. He drew it quickly, from memory, and the room watched him do it with the particular attention that people give to someone who draws technical geometry from memory accurately. "Under thermal expansion at sustained load," Mason said, drawing in the force vectors, "this variation creates a stress concentration here. Not catastrophic on its own, but combined with the cooling inefficiency from the routing issue and the pressure differential from the oil gallery problem, you're stacking 3 compounding factors. Any one of them, in isolation, might not cause a failure within the test window. All 3 together, at real-world load conditions, and you're looking at 90 minutes to fracture initiation." He capped the marker. The room was quiet. Carl looked at the whiteboard for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when the mind behind them is processing something that requires adjustment. "The tolerance spec would need to be written specifically for this application," Carl said. Finally. "Yes. That's a significant redocumentation effort." "Yes." Carl looked at Mason. There was something in his expression that was no longer purely measuring, a crack in it, small but real, where curiosity had gotten through. "What's your background?" "Engineering. Blackstone, actually. About 12 years ago. Junior level. They let me go in a round of cuts." Mason set the marker back in the tray. "Then I ran my own shop." Something shifted in Carl's face, not sympathy exactly, more like a recalibration. "You did their contract repair work," Carl said slowly. "The outsourced stuff." "For 10 years. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was not quite an apology and not quite anything else, "I didn't know there was anyone outside doing that work." "Most people didn't," Mason said. That's fine. Let's talk about the coolant routing redesign. The morning passed in the particular way that productive mornings pass, fast and dense, each hour containing more actual exchange than the previous one. Mason worked his way through the team methodically, asking questions more than giving answers, identifying what each person knew well and where the gaps were, building a picture of the collective intelligence in the room and where it needed to be focused. By 11, the three senior engineers, Carl, and two women named Dr. Reyes and Sanjit, whose credentials Mason didn't know yet, but whose thinking he'd already started to respect, had joined the working group around the main whiteboard rather than maintaining their separate position at the far end of the room. It hadn't been a dramatic reconciliation. It had been the kind of pragmatic regrouping that happens when the problem is interesting enough to make the politics feel like a distraction. Dr. Reyes, it emerged, had been the lead on the thermal management architecture. She was 42, precise in her language, and had the kind of intelligence that expressed itself as consecutive logical steps rather than intuitive leaps. The exact complement to Mason's pattern recognition approach. She'd been defensive at first, the way anyone is defensive when their work is the center of a crisis, but defensive in a productive direction, not denying the problem, but determined to understand it completely. "Walk me through the redesigned routing concept again," she said to Mason, around 11:30, with a pencil in her hand and the look of someone who had stopped listening for reasons to disagree and started listening to actually understand. Mason walked her through it. She asked 7 specific questions, each one building from the last, and her pencil moved constantly as he answered. Notes, diagrams, her own force vectors alongside his. At the end, she was quiet for a moment. "If we route through this channel instead," she said, drawing a modification to Mason's sketch, "we can maintain the original manifold geometry. That cuts the tooling change cost by about 30%. Mason looked at her modification. He thought about it. "Does that maintain the flow rate at high load?" She ran a quick calculation on the notepad. "Yes, within 2%. "That works," he said. She looked up from the notepad. Something in her expression had changed. Not softened exactly, but expanded, the way a room expands when a window is opened. "That's actually better than the original design," she said. "Your modification is," Mason said. "I was working from the failure backward. You know the design forward. Between both directions, we get somewhere neither of us gets alone." Dr. Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the notepad and kept writing, but she was sitting differently than she'd been at the start of the morning. Vanessa came to the engineering floor at noon. She didn't announce herself. She came through the door in the way that people at the top of organizations occasionally move through their own buildings, with the quiet authority of someone who doesn't need to clear a path because paths tend to clear themselves. She stood near the door and looked at the room. What she saw was Mason at the central whiteboard with Dr. Reyes and Patrick on one side and Carl on the other, and the whiteboard so full of calculations and diagrams that a second whiteboard had been rolled in from the side of the room. What she heard was the sound of the room working, overlapping voices, the occasional sharp disagreement that resolved itself in 30 seconds, because everyone in the conversation was focused on the problem, not on being right. She'd walked past this room 100 times in the past year. She'd visited it during milestone reviews, during crisis briefings, during the launch announcement preparation. She'd sat at the head of the conference table in the adjacent meeting room and received status reports and approved timelines. She had not seen it look like this in a long time. Her operations director, a man named Jeff, who had materialized at her elbow, Jeff had a talent for materializing, said quietly, 3 hours in and they've already closed out the oil gallery analysis and started detailed design on the coolant redesign. Patrick's saying they might pull the timeline in by 10 days. Vanessa kept looking at the room. How's the team responding to him? Jeff considered this. Carl was difficult for the first hour. He's not difficult anymore. What changed? Reed drew the force vector analysis on the whiteboard from memory, and it was correct. Carl checked it. A pause. Carl doesn't check things he already thinks are wrong. Vanessa watched Mason for a moment. He was listening to something Dr. Reyes was saying, his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted the way she'd already noticed he held himself when he was concentrating. And then he uncrossed his arms and picked up a marker and made a single modification to the diagram on the board that caused Dr. Reyes to look at it and immediately reach for her own notepad. It was a small thing, probably incomprehensible to anyone outside the specific technical context. But Vanessa understood organizations, and what she was watching was not primarily technical. What she was watching was a room of people who had been stuck, not just technically stuck, but organizationally stuck, the particular kind of gridlock that happens when a crisis generates enough pressure that every conversation becomes about liability rather than solution. And that room was now unstuck. She left before Mason noticed she was there. He called Chloe at 3:15, stepping outside onto the parking structure stairwell for the kind of privacy that corporate buildings with open floor plans don't otherwise offer. How was school? Fine. We had a substitute for math. Was the substitute any good? She kept saying, per se, wrong. What do you mean, wrong? She kept saying per se, like the word say. It's Latin, it's per se. How do you know that? I looked it up, Chloe said, with the tone of someone for whom this was not an unusual thing to do. Where are you? The Blackstone plant. A brief silence. The big one? With the test track? You know about the test track. I looked that up too. Another pause. Are you going to be there a lot now? Mason leaned against the stairwell railing. The parking structure looked out over the test track, which curved away into the distance in the gray afternoon light. 3 days a week for a while. Maybe a few months. Chloe was quiet. That okay? He asked. You're still home on Fridays? Always. And you'll still write the notes? He'd been expecting a lot of possible responses from her. Not that one. He stood there for a second with the phone against his ear and the test track in front of him and his chest doing something complicated and quiet. Every day, he said. Okay, she said, and then, tell me what the engine looks like. So he did. Standing on the stairwell of the Blackstone Motors engineering complex, leaning against the railing, he described the Meridian E7 platform to his 9-year-old daughter the way another parent might describe a movie plot. The architecture, the ambition, the elegant miscalculation at its center, the way the fix was starting to come together in the room upstairs. Chloe asked 3 specific technical questions and one about whether the people he was working with were nice. Some of them, he said. They're getting there. That's usually how it goes, she said. He smiled. He didn't know where she'd gotten that from. Maybe from listening to him talk about engines and the people who built them for her entire life. The understanding that most complicated things started broken and became useful through the slow accumulation of correct attention. Go do your homework, he said. I already did it. Go do something that isn't homework then. I'm going to look up more Latin phrases, she said, and hung up. He worked until 6 that evening, then drove back to Brookhaven with the windows down because the truck's heat worked in the kind of intermittent, unreliable way that suggested it was operating on goodwill rather than mechanical function. He stopped at the grocery store on Route 9 and stood in the cereal aisle for 2 minutes, failing to remember whether Chloe had said she was out of the cereal she liked or just low on it, then bought 2 boxes because the second one wasn't expensive, and the cost of being wrong was a child having no cereal in the morning. Small decisions. The arithmetic of a life with another person in it. He was in the garage after dinner, working on Harold's Mustang. The car still needed him. The deadline was still real, billionaires and corporate crises notwithstanding, when he heard a car in the lot. He didn't look up from the engine bay. He had his hands inside it, and the position was awkward, and moving would mean losing his grip on what he was working on. Doors open, he called. He heard footsteps. Different ones than the previous 2 nights. Not heels this time. Flat shoes, quick step. Vanessa came around the side of the car and stood at the edge of the work light. You were there at noon, Mason said. I saw you come in and leave. A pause. I thought you didn't notice. I noticed things. He made the adjustment he'd been working toward and straightened up, wiping his hands. Something wrong with the plant work? No. Everything at the plant is... Actually, Jeff thinks Patrick's timeline estimate might be optimistic by another week, in the good direction. Reyes's routing modification. I thought that might have knock-on benefits. That's what Patrick said. Vanessa looked at the Mustang. Whose car is this? Retired schoolteacher named Harold. He's been trying to restore it for 11 years. Is it restorable? Everything's restorable if you're patient enough. He set down the rag. What did you come for? She was quiet for a moment. This was different from the previous 2 nights. Not the controlled exhaustion of crisis management, not the formal tension of negotiation. She looked like someone who had driven to a place because she needed to and was still in the process of figuring out what she needed to say when she got there. "I watched you work today," she said, "with the team." "I know. Carl asked me after you left if we could make your involvement permanent." Mason looked at her. "Carl?" "I know," she said. "I know how that sounds given the first hour." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was a conversation I was already having." She looked at her hands for a moment, a gesture he hadn't seen from her before, the absence of the phone, the stillness. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "You've asked me honest questions twice now. They've both been reasonable." "What do you actually want from this?" she asked. "Not the contract terms. You made those clear. What do you actually want to get out of being here? Out of fixing the Meridian?" Mason leaned against the workbench. He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about things he hadn't prepared answers for, which was slower and less neat than the prepared version. "I want the engine to work," he said. "That's the first thing. I want to see a machine that almost worked actually work, because that's just what I do. That's how I'm built." He paused. "And I want Chloe to see that the thing I spent 10 years doing in this garage was worth something. Not the contract, not the rate. The work itself." Vanessa was looking at him. "She already believes that," Vanessa said quietly. "She told me the first morning." "I know she does," Mason said. "But she's 9. I want her to still believe it when she's 29, and the way that happens is if it's actually true." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the garage held its particular nighttime quiet. The settling sounds of metal cooling, the distant highway, the space heater doing its job. "When I was building this company," she said slowly, like a person thinking out loud and not entirely comfortable with the fact, "I told myself the size of it was the point. The bigger it got, the more it mattered. The more people it employed, the more, I don't know, significant it was." She stopped. "I don't know when I stopped thinking about the people and started thinking about the scale." Mason didn't respond to that immediately. He let it sit, probably when it got too big to see both at the same time, he said eventually. She looked at him. "Is that an excuse?" "No, it's just what happens." He picked up his coffee. "The question is what you do when you figure it out." She absorbed this. She looked at the Mustang again. 11 years of intermittent, imperfect effort towards something that wasn't finished yet. "Will Harold ever actually drive it?" she asked. "He'll drive it before the end of the year," Mason said. "I promised him." She nodded slowly, like that answer meant something beyond the literal question. She left at 9, before the night got fully cold, and Mason went back to Harold's car with the space heater positioned toward the work area and the shop light clipped to the engine bay, doing the work that was in front of him the same way he always had. One problem at a time, with the particular patience of someone who had learned through years of broken machines and broken life that most things can be fixed if you're willing to look long enough at what's actually wrong. The test wasn't in the looking, though. The test was in staying after everybody else had gone home. Mason had been staying after everybody else went home for 10 years. He was still here. 3 weeks into the Blackstone engagement, Mason's truck became a fixture in the visitor parking lot on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and the engineering team stopped treating him like a visitor. This happened gradually and without ceremony, the way most real changes happen, not in a meeting, not through an announcement, but through the slow accumulation of small moments that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. It was the Tuesday morning when Carl Weiss arrived at the central whiteboard before Mason and had already written out the thermal gradient calculations from the previous day's session, ready to continue. It was the Wednesday afternoon when Dr. Reyes sent him a direct message through the internal system, not Patrick's system, not routed through anyone, just her name and his, a direct line, with a question about coolant viscosity coefficients that she'd been thinking about overnight. It was the Thursday when one of the younger engineers, a 23-year-old named Tomas, who had been on the Meridian team for 8 months and had barely spoken in Mason's presence for the first 2 weeks, slid a chair up next to him at the workbench without asking and said, "Can I show you something?" and showed him a calculation error he'd found in the original design validation that none of the senior engineers had caught. Mason looked at the calculation for 30 seconds and said, "That's a real find. Take that to Reyes directly. Don't route it through Carl. Tomas blinked. Why not Carl? Because Carl will tell you it's a minor issue and file it as a footnote. Reyes will understand what it means for the load model. Mason handed the paper back. You found it. Make sure the right person hears it from you. Tomas looked at the paper, then back at Mason with the expression of someone who had just been told something that seemed simple but wasn't. He went to find Dr. Reyes. Mason watched him go and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of that. Not of being right, but of pointing someone in a useful direction. He'd had nobody to do that for him early in his career at Blackstone. He'd had a manager in a gray fleece who cared about quarterly metrics, and a team that was too busy protecting their own positions to notice what the junior engineers were actually finding. He hadn't been bitter about it for a long time, but he remembered it clearly enough to do the opposite when the opportunity appeared. The Meridian corrections were moving faster than anyone had projected, and this created its own complications. The board had been told 6 weeks. Patrick's revised estimate, after Reyes's routing modification was validated against the full load model, was 41 days. This was good news in the absolute sense. Every day the platform was offline was a day of revenue pressure and investor anxiety. But it created a secondary problem that Mason identified on a Wednesday morning when he arrived at the plant and found the engineering floor in a state of organized friction. The manufacturing team had been brought in for pre-implementation review, and they and the engineering team were, in the polite and technically specific way that manufacturing and engineering teams often are, in fundamental disagreement. The manufacturing lead was a man named Brian Cho, who had 20 years of production experience and the specific kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly how many ways a design change can fail between the drawing and the factory floor. He was standing at the far end of the engineering space with a printed copy of the coolant routing redesign, and he was not happy. The tooling lead time alone, Brian was saying, to Patrick and Dr. Reyes and 3 people Mason didn't recognize from manufacturing, is 12 days minimum. Add the validation run, which we cannot skip, I don't care what the timeline pressure is, and you're at 19 days before first production unit. That's assuming 0 rework on the casting tolerance spec, which, the casting tolerance change is a documentation revision, Dr. Reyes said. It doesn't affect the tooling. It affects the inspection protocol, which affects quality sign-off, which is on my timeline. Brian put the printed design down on the nearest desk with a firmness that was just short of a slam. I need 3 more days in the production schedule. 3 more days puts us past the board deadline. The board deadline isn't my engineering problem. Mason had come in during the middle of this exchange and positioned himself at a workstation on the edge of it, listening. He recognized the dynamic. It was not primarily a technical dispute. Both Brian and Dr. Reyes were right about their respective domains. The problem was the boundary between those domains, and the fact that nobody had fully mapped what happened at that boundary under schedule pressure. He waited for a pause. Brian, he said, the inspection protocol change, what specifically is driving the timeline on that? Brian looked at him. They hadn't met before. Brian had the measured, assessing look of someone who has learned through experience to be cautious about outside voices weighing in on production problems. Coordinate measurement validation on the casting, Brian said. New tolerance spec, new measurement parameters, new baseline calibration. That's not paperwork. That's physical time in the metrology lab. How many units does the calibration baseline need to cover? 25 for statistical validity. What if you ran the calibration on the existing test units from the current failure analysis? They've already been through full measurement cycles. The baseline data exists. Brian looked at him. Those units failed. Right. So you have complete measurement documentation from before failure, at failure initiation, and post-failure. That's more information than a standard calibration baseline gives you, not less. You'd be calibrating against a dataset that includes the exact failure mode you're guarding against. Brian was quiet. Dr. Reyes looked at Mason, then at Brian. That's valid, she said carefully. If the metrology team accepts the existing dataset as baseline, the metrology team accepts what I tell them to accept, Brian said, not arrogantly, just factually, the way a man states a jurisdictional fact. He was still looking at Mason. Who are you? Mason Reed, independent contractor. You a manufacturing engineer? I've done enough manufacturing work to know the metrology question is the constraint. If the data set from the failure units works as your calibration baseline, how many days does that save you? Brian did the calculation visibly, his eyes not quite focusing on anything in the room. 2.5? Maybe 3. Which gets you back inside the board deadline. Which gets me inside the board deadline, Brian said, in the tone of a man who is not yet committing to agreement but has stopped opposing. He picked up the printed design again and looked at it. He looked at Mason. This routing change, you came up with this? First version. Reyes improved it. Brian glanced at Reyes. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of mutual professional recognition. I've been trying to get the design team to talk to manufacturing before implementation for 4 years, Brian said. I know, Reyes said, with the tone of someone acknowledging a legitimate, long-standing complaint. It's easier when there's someone in the middle who understands both sides, Mason said. Brian looked at him again. The measuring quality in that look had changed slightly. Less caution, more consideration. How long are you here for? Few months, maybe more. We should talk about the oil gallery supplier qualification, Brian said. That's going to be its own problem, and I'd rather get ahead of it. Tuesday, Mason said. Morning. Tuesday morning, Brian said, and picked up his phone and walked to the other side of the room, already making a call. Dr. Reyes looked at Mason. How did you know the metrology calibration was the constraint? She asked. Because everything else on Brian's list had a workaround and that one didn't, Mason said. When someone with 20 years of experience leads with a specific technical detail in an argument, that's the real thing. Everything else is negotiating position. Reyes absorbed this. She had the look she sometimes got, a slight narrowing of focus, as if recalibrating something. You do that a lot. Listen for what people are actually saying instead of what they're saying. Engines and people have that in common, Mason said. The noise isn't usually the problem. The problem's somewhere quieter. Vanessa heard about the manufacturing alignment from Jeff before she heard it from Mason, which had become something of a pattern. Jeff's role had evolved, in the 3 weeks since Mason's engagement began, to include a function that nobody had formalized, but that Jeff himself described as telling the CEO what Reed did today that fixed something nobody told her was broken. She didn't mind this. What she minded was the implication within it, the accumulating evidence that her organization had more structural problems than the Meridian failure had revealed, and that a man working in her building 3 days a week was seeing them more clearly than people who worked there full-time. She was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon when Diane appeared in her office doorway with the expression she wore when something required Vanessa's attention that wasn't on the schedule. The investor call, Diane said. Which one? Harmon Capital. Vanessa set down what she was reading. Martin Harmon was Blackstone's second-largest institutional investor, a man of 63 who had made his fortune in private equity and who communicated exclusively through implications, a style that Vanessa had spent 3 years learning to decode. When Martin Harmon called outside of a scheduled engagement, it was never to discuss things that were going well. She took the call in her office with the door closed. Vanessa. Martin's voice had the particular quality it got when he was managing something. I've been looking at the Meridian timeline revision. Good news on that front. We're tracking ahead of the revised estimate. I've heard. A pause. I've also heard the progress is substantially attributable to outside consultation. Vanessa had been expecting a version of this. She hadn't expected it this quickly. We brought in an independent contractor with specific expertise in the failure mode. That's not unusual in crisis engineering situations. The contractor's name appears 13 times in the engineering communications I've reviewed over the past 2 weeks, including a manufacturing alignment that apparently saved 3 days of production timeline. He's been effective. He's been essential, Martin said, which is a different thing, and it raises questions for me about the depth of internal capability on the engineering team. A pause. Questions that, I have to be honest with you, connect to questions I've had since the failure was first disclosed. Vanessa kept her voice even. The failure was a testing protocol gap, not a capability gap. The team spent 8 days not finding what an outside mechanic found in 7 hours, Martin said. Not cruelly. Martin was never cruel. He was precise, which was often worse. That's a fact in the record, And now the same person appears to be functioning as an informal liaison between engineering and manufacturing in a way that suggests that liaison function didn't exist before. A pause. What happens when his engagement ends? The question sat in the room. Vanessa had been asking herself a version of it for the past 10 days. She hadn't found an answer she was satisfied with yet. I'm working on a longer-term structural solution, she said. Good, Martin said, because the board has confidence in the Meridian recovery. What they're less certain about is whether the underlying conditions that produce the failure have changed or whether we've just found a very good person to manage the symptoms. After the call ended, Vanessa sat in her office for a few minutes. Then she called Diane and asked her to block out 2 hours the following Tuesday morning. Itent. She found Mason in the metrology lab with Brian Cho, which was not a location she had previously associated with her Tuesday morning schedule. The metrology lab was on the ground floor of the manufacturing building, a room of precise instruments and controlled temperature and the slightly antiseptic quality of environments where measurement error is a meaningful concept. Brian was showing Mason something on a calibration display. They were both leaning toward the screen with the posture of people engaged in something specific. She waited near the door. After a few minutes, Mason straightened up and saw her. He said something quietly to Brian, who glanced over his shoulder at Vanessa and nodded once with the expression of a man who had decided, at some recent point, that the CEO's presence in his lab was no longer particularly surprising. Mason came toward her. Good meeting? She asked. The supplier qualification issue Brian mentioned is real, Mason said. The oil gallery component. The revised tolerance spec requires a supplier that can hold a tighter bore diameter than the current vendor. We need to get ahead of that, or it's going to be a bottleneck 6 weeks from now. Talk to procurement? Brian's already on it, but someone at the VP level needs to authorize the expedited vendor qualification process, or it'll sit in a queue. He looked at her. That's probably a 30-minute decision for whoever has the authority. It's a 3-week delay if nobody makes it. Vanessa pulled out her phones. 2 texts, one to Jeff, one to the VP of procurement. The decision was made in the time it took them to walk from the metrology lab to the engineering building. Mason noticed this. He noticed most things she'd come to understand. He didn't say anything about it, but there was a quality to his attention, a kind of patient, observational steadiness that registered what was happening around him whether or not he commented. I had a call with Martin Harmon yesterday, she said, as they walked. Investor? Second largest. He wants to know what happens when your engagement ends. Mason was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him I was working on a structural solution. She paused. Which means I need to actually work on one. What does that mean for me? She stopped walking. They were in the corridor between the manufacturing building and the engineering building, a connecting passage that was functional rather than designed. Gray walls, overhead lighting, a floor that had been repainted over a visible seam where 2 different construction phases had met. The kind of space that exists in large organizations because large organizations generate more transitional space than anyone plans for. I want to offer you a permanent role, she said. Director of Systems Integration. It's a new position. The function it describes is something the company has needed for a long time and didn't have a name for. The work you've been doing with engineering and manufacturing, the way you operate across functional boundaries. It's real authority. Budget authority, direct reporting line to me, ability to pull people across departments when there's a systems-level problem. Mason looked at her. What's the catch? He asked. Full-time, in the building. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere deeper in the building, a piece of manufacturing equipment ran a test cycle, a rhythmic mechanical sound barely audible. Chloe, he said, I know. The garage. I know. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to choose between your life and this job. I'm asking whether there's a version of this job that fits inside your life. A pause. What would that look like? He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if the question was unanswerable. He had the look he got when he was working through something. Not calculating exactly, more like listening for something he hadn't heard yet. Chloe gets out of school at 3:15, he said. I need to be reachable by phone after 3 every day. I need to be physically available by 4 if something comes up. Not often, but when it does. I need Friday as a standing work from anywhere day, and I need the garage to stay operating as a separate entity. He stopped. The garage isn't just income, it's what I built. I'm not folding it into a corporate arrangement. None of that is a problem, Vanessa said. You haven't checked with HR. I don't need to check with HR. I'm asking you a question about what you need to say yes, not what the standard terms allow. He looked at her. That's not how most companies work. I know how most companies work, she said. I've been building one for 8 years. Some of the things I've learned are about what I should have been doing differently. A pause. This is one of them. Mason was quiet again. The executive role you offered me before, he said finally. Right after the initial diagnostic. I turned it down. I remember. I turned it down because it felt like the company trying to acquire something it didn't want to invest in building. He looked at her steadily. This feels different. It is different. Why? Because I know what I'm asking for now, she said. Before, I was trying to solve a crisis. Now I'm trying to fix something structural. Those require different things from you, and they require me to give you something different back. He considered this. The Mustang, he said. She blinked. What? Harold's Mustang. I told him I'd have it running before the end of the year. That's 3 months from now. I need to finish that first. She stared at him for a moment. A car. I made a promise to an 81-year-old man, Mason said. The car matters to him. I said I'd finish it. You can still finish it. The garage stays open. I know. I just needed to say it out loud. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. If I take this, I need one more thing. Name it. Patrick reports to me. Not because I need the authority, because he's the best engineer on that team and everyone above him is going to try to manage him into mediocrity if there isn't someone running interference. He found the casting variation. He wrote the honest report. That kind of person needs to be protected or they leave. Something moved in Vanessa's expression. Agreed. And Tomas? I don't know who. Young engineer on the Meridian team, 23. He found a validation calculation error last week that nobody else caught. He's going to be exceptional if he doesn't get crushed in the organizational structure first. Vanessa was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the controlled executive composure, not the exhausted honesty of the first night in the garage. Something quieter than both. You've been watching the people as closely as the engine. The engine doesn't work if the people don't, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Yes to which part? All of it. Patrick, Tomas, the terms, the garage, all of it. She held out her hand, not a document, not a contract, just her hand. Do we have a deal? He looked at her hand. He looked at her. He shook it once, firmly. Get me the formal terms by Thursday, he said. I'll have a lawyer look at it. You have a lawyer? I have a retired lawyer who lives 2 blocks from me and does occasional work in exchange for me keeping his pickup truck running. He's slow but thorough. Vanessa made a sound that was so brief it almost didn't register. Half a laugh, genuine, unguarded. She pulled it back almost immediately, but it had been there. They walked back toward the engineering building. He told Chloe that night over dinner. Spaghetti, because it was Thursday. And Thursday had been spaghetti night for as long as either of them could remember, a ritual established in the period after Laura died when Mason had been trying to impose enough structure on their weeks to keep them from feeling shapeless. Full-time? Chloe said. Not the way it sounds. Same schedule as now, mostly. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays at the plant, Mondays here. Fridays are still ours. Chloe wound spaghetti around her fork with the focused attention of someone who was thinking about something else. Is it more money? Significantly. How significantly? Enough that you can have the new shoes without waiting for a sale. She looked up at him. The shoe comment was a small thing. The shoes hadn't been a crisis. He'd been going to get them regardless. But it landed between them as what it was, which was him telling her in practical terms that things were going to be less tight, less calculated, less reliant on the particular brand of quiet financial tension that had been the background frequency of their life together for several years. Okay, she said. Okay, just like that? You already decided, she said. I can tell. She looked back at her spaghetti. You get the deciding look. What does the deciding look like? Like you're not really here, but you're also not worried, she said. Like you figured something out already. and you're just catching up to it. He sat with that for a moment. The garage stays, he said. I know it stays. It's your garage. And Harold's car gets finished. Obviously. She ate a bite of spaghetti. Did you write my note for tomorrow? Already packed in your lunch. What does it say? You'll find out tomorrow. She gave him the look, the one that said she didn't entirely believe him but wasn't going to push it. And they finished dinner in the comfortable quiet of people who had spent enough years together in a small space to be genuinely at ease in each other's silence. The Meridian test run happened on a Friday, which meant Mason wasn't at the plant for it. He knew it was happening. Patrick had messaged him the night before with the schedule. Full load, 6-hour cycle, all 3 corrected systems operating simultaneously. The first time a complete corrected unit had run under real-world parameters rather than simulation. The message was professional and specific, which was Patrick's way. But underneath the specificity, there was the particular energy of someone standing at the edge of something significant. Mason sent back 2 words. Let me know. He spent the morning in the garage, working on Harold's Mustang. The car was close now. He could feel it the way he always felt it when a long-running job was approaching completion, a quality of the work itself becoming more refinement than restoration, each session adding precision rather than changing the fundamental character. At 11:40, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Patrick. No words, just a video. 15 seconds, shot from the test bay floor, showing the Meridian E7 running. Just running. Smooth and complete, and producing the sound that engines produce when every system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, a sound that is not dramatic but is unmistakable to anyone who has spent time around engines that don't work. Mason watched the video once. He set the phone down. He picked up his wrench and went back to Harold's car. He was smiling, but there was nobody there to see it, which was fine. The important part wasn't the smile. The important part was what the sound in the video meant. 40,000 jobs that were still jobs, suppliers that were still in business, a platform that had almost failed finding the right shape of itself. All of it visible in 15 seconds of an engine running the way it was supposed to run. He'd spent 10 years fixing things in this garage without anyone seeing him do it. Being seen was newer and stranger, and he wasn't entirely sure yet how to hold it. But the work felt the same. That was the thing he hadn't expected. That taking the title, the role, the formal acknowledgement hadn't changed the texture of the work itself. The problems were the same problems. The process was the same process. The satisfaction of identifying a failure and working toward its correction, patient and methodical and genuinely interested in what the machine was trying to tell you. That was the same as it had always been. He'd been doing it for 10 years in a cold garage for a company that didn't know his name. Now he'd be doing it in a building with a badge and a budget and a parking space. He wasn't sure which version of himself was more real. Both, probably. He picked up the phone and called Harold. "Harold," he said when the old man answered. "I want to talk to you about a date." "A date?" Harold's voice had the careful quality of a man who has been disappointed about this car enough times to be cautious about optimism. "For a test drive," Mason said. A long pause. "How long do I have to wait?" Harold asked quietly. 6 weeks, Mason said. 8 at the outside. Another pause. Longer. And in it, Mason could hear the particular silence of an 81-year-old man who had spent 11 years believing something might happen and was only now letting himself fully believe it. "I'll buy the gas," Harold said. "I know you will," Mason said. He hung up and went back to work. Outside, the Monday morning was gray and ordinary, and the road past his garage was quiet, in the way it was always quiet this time of week. And in a few months it would start being Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays at the plant, and Mondays here, and Fridays with Chloe, and the garage would still be the garage. His father's shelving, the hydraulic lift that needed coaxing, the mister, coffee on the bench. And all of it would continue in the particular imperfect way that things continue when you're stubborn enough to keep showing up. He'd been showing up for 10 years. The math on that, it turned out, had been adding up the whole time. The formal contract arrived on a Thursday, as promised. Mason's lawyer, a retired man named Arthur Bellamy, who lived in a blue house 2 blocks from the garage, and whose pickup truck Mason had been keeping alive for 6 years through a series of repairs that Arthur cheerfully described as mechanical charity, called him Friday morning with his assessment. It's a good contract, Arthur said. Better than good. Whoever drafted this took your terms seriously. Any problems? 3 small language issues I want cleaned up. Intellectual property clause needs to be explicit that your independent work at the garage stays yours. The non-compete is written broadly. I want it narrowed to Blackstone's direct competitors only, not the whole industry, and the termination language needs a mutual clause, not just the company's right to exit. How long to negotiate those? If they're reasonable? 2 days? A pause. Are they reasonable? Mason thought about Vanessa in the corridor outside the metrology lab, hand extended, no document, just her word. Yeah, he said. They're reasonable. He was right. The 3 changes came back accepted by Tuesday morning, clean and without counter-negotiation, and Arthur called to deliver his verdict with the satisfaction of a man who had found the process professionally adequate. Sign it, Arthur said. And when the truck needs the alternator replaced, I'm calling in the favor. The alternator's fine. For now, Arthur said, with the cheerfulness of someone who knew engines only well enough to be concerned about them, and hung up. Mason signed the contract at his workbench on a Tuesday morning before driving to the plant, with the Mr. Coffee making its sounds beside him, and Harold's nearly finished Mustang occupying the second bay, and the November light coming gray and flat through the garage windows. He didn't feel the occasion required ceremony. He'd spent 10 years doing the work without a title. Having a title now didn't change what the work was. He signed his name, put the contract in an envelope for Diane to collect, and drove to Blackstone. His first act as Director of Systems Integration, a title that still sat slightly awkwardly when he said it aloud, like a suit that was the right size but hadn't been broken in yet, was to schedule a meeting that nobody had asked for. He called it a cross-functional diagnostic review, which was the kind of language that looked legitimate in a calendar invite and meant, in practice, that he was putting Brian Cho and Dr. Reyes and Carl Weiss and Patrick in the same room with the VP of Procurement and the head of Quality Assurance, and asking them to walk him through every active project that had a known problem nobody had formally escalated. The meeting was supposed to be 2 hours. It ran for 4.5. What emerged was not a surprise to Mason, though it appeared to surprise several of the people in the room. The company had at least 6 active engineering or production issues that had been identified at the working level and had not moved upward through the organization because the people who found them had no clear mechanism to move them, or had tried to move them and encountered the particular organizational friction of problems that are inconvenient to acknowledge before they become impossible to ignore. He wrote everything on the whiteboard, all of it, without attributing blame or calibrating the language for palatability. By the time he finished, the whiteboard looked like the inside of a machine that had been opened and found to be more complicated than its external appearance suggested, which was, in Mason's experience, what most organizations looked like when someone finally asked the right questions. That's a lot of problems, the VP of Procurement said, in the careful tone of a man assessing whether he was looking at a crisis or a workload. It's a manageable number of problems, Mason said. The issue isn't the number. The issue is that they've been sitting at the working level for months because there was no path from finding a problem to fixing a problem that didn't require someone to take on organizational risk. He capped the marker. That's what this role is supposed to fix. Problems come to me. I route them to the right people with the right authority. Nobody has to risk their career for noticing something wrong. Carl Weiss, sitting at the far end of the table, said, "You're describing a function that used to exist here about 10 years ago." Mason looked at him. "What happened to it?" Mason asked. "Budget reorganization," Carl said, with the flat effect of someone who has explained this before and received unsatisfying answers. The systems integration team was folded into product engineering, which has different priorities. "Different incentives," Dr. Reyes said. "Same thing," Carl said. Mason looked at the whiteboard. "Okay, let's start with the highest risk items and work down." They did. It took the rest of the morning. By noon, 4 of the 6 issues had assigned owners and timelines. The 5th was scheduled for a follow-up session with manufacturing. The 6th, a supplier quality problem that had been building for 8 months. Mason marked for his own attention and called Brian Cho directly after the meeting to discuss. Brian answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when that one was going to surface," he said, which told Mason that Brian had known about it for a while and had been waiting for someone to bring it into the open. "How long?" Mason asked. 6 months, maybe 7. I flagged it twice in quarterly reports. Both times it got a note and no action. Send me the reports. A pause. And Brian, going forward, anything that gets a note and no action comes to me within a week, okay? A brief silence on Brian's end. The kind of silence that meant something was being recalibrated. Yeah, Brian said. Okay. Vanessa heard about the cross-functional meeting from Jeff, same as always, and this time Jeff's summary was longer than usual. She listened to it in her car on the way to a board presentation, and when he finished, she was quiet long enough that he asked whether she was still there. 6 issues, she said. 6 that were identified in the meeting. His read is there are probably more. How did the VPs respond? Jeff considered this. The procurement VP looked like a man who had just been told his house had load-bearing issues he hadn't known about, but was relieved to know about before the wall fell. Quality assurance was more defensive, but nobody argued with the substance. Because the substance was accurate. Right. She was quiet again for a moment. The board presentation she was heading to was about the Meridian recovery, investor confidence update, production timeline, market re-entry plan. She'd been preparing it for a week. It was a good story. Platform corrected, timeline beat, team stabilized, new structural leadership in place. Jeff, she said, the 6 issues he found, are any of them material to investor disclosure? A pause. The supplier quality problem might be. I'd want legal to look at it. Get legal on it today. She looked out the car window. And put the cross-functional diagnostic review on a monthly recurring schedule. You want it on your calendar? No, I want it on Reed's calendar and a summary on mine. A pause. He doesn't need me in the room for the meeting to work. He needs me available when something comes out of it that requires authority above his level. That's a significant delegation, Jeff said carefully. I know what it is, she said. The car was quiet for a moment, the city moving past the windows. Jeff, she said, when did we stop having a function that caught problems before they became crises? Jeff was quiet for exactly the length of time that suggested he knew the answer and was deciding how to say it. About 9 years ago, he said finally. Budget reorganization. The systems integration team was folded into product engineering, she said. You knew? I just found out, she said. She looked out the window the rest of the way to the board meeting. November became December in the way that months become months, not as an event, but as a gradual accumulation of days that each resembled the day before, until you noticed one morning that the light was different and the cold had changed character and time had moved further than you'd tracked it. Mason's rhythm settled. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays at Blackstone, Mondays at the garage, Fridays with Chloe. On Mondays, the garage was quiet in a different way than it used to be. Not the anxious quiet of a man waiting for a tow truck that might not come, but the working quiet of a man who had other things happening in his life and was choosing to be here anyway. Harold's Mustang occupied the main bay. A diesel truck from a regular client was in the second bay. 3 smaller jobs were organized on the shelving by parts and sequence. The work was the same work. He'd had people offer to help. Tomas had asked, once, whether Mason could use a second set of hands at the garage on weekends. An offer that was genuine and which Mason had declined gently because the garage wasn't a training ground and it wasn't a networking opportunity. It was his. That distinction mattered. Chloe turned 10 in the second week of December. He'd asked her a month earlier what she wanted for her birthday, going through the usual routine of suggesting things she'd mentioned casually and watching her face for the particular expression that meant he'd gotten warm. She'd said, I want to see the test track. He'd looked at her. The Blackstone test track. You said the engine runs now. I want to see it run. He'd called Patrick the next day. Patrick had required approximately 4 seconds to agree and had spent the rest of the call figuring out logistics with the energy of someone given a problem they found genuinely interesting to solve. On the Saturday of Chloe's birthday, Mason drove to the Blackstone plant with his daughter in the passenger seat of the truck, and Chloe spent the entire drive with her face turned toward the window, watching the industrial edge of the city give way to the facility's perimeter fence, saying almost nothing, which meant she was taking everything in. Patrick met them at the gate, He was wearing a Blackstone fleece and carrying 2 visitor badges, and he greeted Chloe with the specific, careful formality of a young person who has been told this is an important occasion and is trying to rise to it without being stiff. "You're the one who found the error in the validation calculation," Chloe said to him, immediately upon being introduced. Patrick blinked. He looked at Mason. Mason looked elsewhere. "Your dad told you about that?" Patrick asked. "He talks about the work," Chloe said, with the tone of someone for whom this is simply a fact of her existence. "He described all of you. He said you were the one who wrote the honest report, even though it was going to make people uncomfortable." Patrick was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pride, something between them that didn't have a clean name. "I just said what was accurate," he said. "That's what he said you'd say," Chloe said. She looked toward the facility. "Can we see the engine?" Mindchen. They spent 2 hours at the plant. Patrick took them through the engineering floor. Chloe moved through it with her eyes taking everything in, asking specific questions that made Patrick recalibrate his explanations upward from the version he'd prepared for a 10-year-old. And then to the test bay, where a production-ready Meridian E7 was in a mid-cycle run. The sound of it hit Chloe before the visual. She stopped walking when she heard it, 3 feet from the test bay entrance, and stood there for a second. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," Mason said. She went forward and stood at the observation window. The engine ran on the other side of the glass, mounted to the test fixture, all its systems operating, gauges tracking across their ranges in the normal bands that represented everything working the way it was designed to work. She watched it for a long time without speaking. "It sounds different than I thought," she said finally. "Different how?" "I thought it would sound bigger," she said, "for all the trouble it caused." Patrick, standing beside Mason, made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh. Mason kept a straight face. "A lot of serious problems sound ordinary when they're running right," Mason said. "That's how you know they're fixed." Chloe considered this. She looked at the engine another moment. "The coolant routing goes here?" She put her finger on the glass at the approximate location she meant. "Close," Mason said. "A little left." She moved her finger. "There," he said. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away. And then she turned from the window with the expression she had when she'd seen what she needed to see and was ready to move on to the next thing. "Okay," she said. "Can we get lunch? I want the kind of place with the soup." Patrick took them to a diner a half-mile from the facility that he described as the place the manufacturing guys go when they need to have a real conversation. It had vinyl booths and laminated menus and a soup that turned out to be a very good chicken and vegetable, and they sat for an hour and a half talking about things that had nothing to do with engines. Chloe's current Latin project, a movie Patrick had seen recently, the question of whether 12-year-old trucks were more or less reliable than modern trucks, which produced the only significant disagreement of the afternoon, with Chloe firmly on the side of the older truck and Patrick cautiously on the side of modern diagnostics. Mason listened to them argue about it and ate his soup. Outside, the December afternoon was cold and flat and ordinary. He thought about the note he'd packed in Chloe's lunch that morning, which had said, "Happy birthday, kid. 10 years and you're still the best thing I ever built." He'd been uncertain about that one. It was more than his usual brief notes, more direct than he typically went, but he'd folded it in anyway. She hadn't mentioned it, but he'd seen her fold it into her jacket pocket at breakfast, and that was enough. It was always enough. Harold drove the Mustang on a Saturday in late December. Mason had finished it 3 days before Christmas, the final session running until nearly midnight. The last adjustments to the carburetor, the idle speed set, the timing dialed in to a point where the engine ran with the particular smoothness that meant everything was correctly synchronized. He'd started it alone in the garage at 11:45, listened to it idle for 5 minutes, made one small adjustment, and then stood back and looked at the car. 11 years of someone else's unfinished project, 3 months of his focused work. He turned it off, covered it with a drop cloth, and went to bed. Harold came to pick it up at 10 in the morning. He arrived in his daughter's car, driven by his daughter, a woman of about 50 named Carol, who had called Mason the previous week to make sure the plan was real because, she said, her father had been talking about this car for my entire adult life, and if it falls through one more time, I think it will genuinely break something in him. Mason had told her it wouldn't fall through. He pulled the drop cloth off when Harold and Carol came into the garage. Harold stood in front of the Mustang and didn't say anything for a moment. He was 81 years old, slightly stooped, with hands that showed decades of use and eyes that had been looking at this car, in various states of incompletion, across more than a decade of Saturdays and hopeful assessments and eventual realistic retreats. He'd bought the car when he was 70, which was already an audacious act, the purchase of a project at an age when most people were reducing rather than expanding their commitments. "It's the same color," Harold said, finally. "Original paint where it could be saved. Matched where it couldn't," Mason said. "I've got documentation of everything that was replaced versus restored. It's in the folder in the glove compartment." Harold walked slowly around the car. He ran his hand along the rear quarter panel, the roofline, the front fender. His daughter stood near the door with her arms crossed, not saying anything, her face doing the complicated work of watching someone you love receive something they've waited a very long time for. "Start it," Harold said. Mason started it. The sound filled the garage, not the refined precision of the Meridian test bay, nothing like it, but the particular voice of a 60-year-old American V8 that had been properly returned to itself, muscular and uneven in the characterful way of old machines that were never designed to be quiet, only to run. Harold stood next to the car with his hand on the roof and his eyes closed for a few seconds. Carol turned away briefly. Mason looked at the workbench. Some things didn't require commentary. "I want to drive it," Harold said. "I know. Right now." "I figured." Harold got in. Mason moved his truck so the driveway was clear. Carol stood on the sidewalk watching as her 81-year-old father backed a 1968 Ford Mustang out of a garage for the first time, in working condition, 11 years and one broken promise after he'd bought it. Harold drove it around the block. He came back. He parked it in front of the garage. He got out. He looked at Mason for a long moment. "How much do I still owe you?" Harold asked. "2 payments," Mason said. "You know the amount." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "3 payments," he said, "and a little extra." Mason started to object. "Don't," Harold said. "I've been paying you below what this work is worth for 3 months because it was what I could manage. I know what the job was worth. Let me finish it right." Mason took the envelope. "Thank you, Harold," he said. Harold looked at the car one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping your word." He drove home in his daughter's car, following the Mustang, which Carol drove back to Harold's house slowly and slightly nervously, but upright and running under its own power all the way. Mason stood in front of the empty garage for a minute after they left. The bay was open. Cold air was coming in. There was oil on the floor where the Mustang had been parked. He went inside and found the next job on the shelf. Vanessa came to the garage on a Tuesday in January. Not for a meeting, not for any functional reason that required being there. She showed up at 9 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Route 9 that Mason had mentioned once, in passing as being the better option in the area. And the fact that she'd remembered this and acted on it was the kind of small thing that people don't do unless they're paying attention. Mason was already working on a new client's engine, a referral from Brian Cho as it happened, one of the manufacturing supervisors whose personal vehicle had developed a noise that nobody at the dealership had been able to identify. The referral had been Brian's way of saying something without saying it, the same way a lot of things at Blackstone were said, through action rather than language. Mason took the coffee. "You could have called," he said. "I wanted to see it," she said, "now that it's not a crisis." She looked around the garage with the same careful attention she'd given it on the first night, but different. Not assessing a crisis, not cataloging desperation. Just looking, the hydraulic lift, the part shelving built from mismatched lumber, the Mr. Coffee, the new engine on the stand where Harold's Mustang used to be. "Harold's car," she said. "He drove it?" 2 weeks before Christmas. She nodded slowly. "Good." She sat on the stool near the workbench. Not the folding chair from the first night, but the workbench stool that had been there for 30 years, scarred and permanent. She held her coffee and watched him work for a while without talking. And this was, Mason had come to recognize, one of the things about Vanessa Sinclair that was different from the version of her that existed in press profiles and investor presentations. She could be quiet, not the controlled silence of someone managing a pause for strategic effect, but the actual quiet of a person who is capable of being somewhere without performing being somewhere. "Martin Harmon called me again," she said. Mason kept working. "Good news or bad?" "Complicated news." She turned the cup in her hands. "He wants to know if we can replicate what you're doing, the cross-functional role, not just for Blackstone. He has 3 other portfolio companies with similar structural problems. He wants to understand the model." Mason looked up at her. "He wants to franchise it. He wants to understand it well enough to build it elsewhere." She met his gaze. "I told him I'd ask you. You told a major investor you'd ask me." "You built the model," she said. "I'm not going to present it as my idea." Mason thought about this. "What does asking me mean, practically?" "It means, if you're willing, at some point, probably in the spring, sitting down with Martin and walking him through how you think about it, how you identify the real problems versus the reported problems, how you navigate the organizational dynamics, the thinking behind it." She paused. "Not the specific Blackstone proprietary information, the methodology. That's a meeting, not an obligation." "Yes." He turned back to the engine. He worked for a minute, and Vanessa didn't fill the silence, which he appreciated. "You know what that methodology is, fundamentally?" he said. "Tell me. Look at the actual thing, not the report about the thing, not the simulation of the thing, not the summary 3 levels removed from the thing. The actual thing." He moved the flashlight to a different angle. "And listen to the people closest to it, because they almost always know where the problem is. They just don't always have someone to tell who can do something about it." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" she said. "That's the whole model." "The whole model," Mason said. "The execution is harder than the model." "It always is." He worked for another minute. She drank her coffee. "Chloe starts middle school in September," she said. He looked up, slightly surprised she knew this. "Patrick told you?" "Chloe told me. Last Tuesday when I stopped by the plant with the procurement review." A pause. "She was there because you were running long and she came with her homework. She sat in the conference room and did it while you finished." "She does that sometimes." She explained the Latin root of systemic to 3 senior engineers while they were waiting for the meeting to start. Vanessa's expression was doing the thing it occasionally did, the controlled composure showing a crack where something less practiced was visible. "Carl Weiss told me about it. He seemed genuinely charmed." "Carl being charmed is unsettling." "That's what Patrick said too." She looked into her coffee. "She's remarkable. You know that." "I know," Mason said. "She gets that from you." He looked at her. She held the look, which meant she wasn't saying it as flattery. She was saying it as observation, the way she said most things she actually meant. "She gets it from paying attention," he said. "Same as everyone who figures anything out." Vanessa nodded slowly, like that answer had landed somewhere useful. They stayed like that for a while. Him working, her sitting, the garage doing what garages do on cold January mornings, which is exist in a state of functional imperfection that has its own kind of integrity. The heater ran. The coffee was good. Outside, the road past the garage was empty in the early hour. The same road where the Blackstone tow truck had turned in every Monday morning for 10 years. Anonymous and reliable, and noticed by nobody. Mason thought about those Monday mornings sometimes. Not with bitterness, but with the particular quality of attention you give to a period of your life that was harder than it needed to be, and that made you into something the easier version wouldn't have produced. He'd spent 10 years fixing things that a company considered disposable, doing work that mattered to real people and real machines and real families, while the organization above him never once looked down to see who was doing it. He didn't romanticize that period. It had been genuinely hard. The money had been consistently tight. Chloe had worn shoes that were too small for 2 months because the timing was wrong. There had been more cold dinners eaten at the workbench than anyone should eat, and more nights of lying awake doing math that didn't quite work, and more Monday mornings of watching a road and calculating whether the thing coming down it was going to be enough. What he understood now, in a way he hadn't fully articulated to himself until recently, was that the decade hadn't been wasted. It had been, in the most direct sense possible, the work. Every failure he'd diagnosed in this garage, every machine he'd returned to function, every hour of looking at something broken until he understood exactly what it was telling him, that had been the accumulation of something real, something that couldn't be compressed or shortcut or replicated by someone who hadn't put in the time. The title was new. The building was new. The badge and the parking space and the budget authority were all new. The thing that made them mean anything was not new. That had been built across 10 years in a cold garage in Brookhaven by a man who showed up because someone had to. Chloe came home from school that afternoon and found Vanessa still in the garage. Not still sitting, but standing near the hydraulic lift asking questions about how it worked, and Mason explaining it with the particular patience he had for explaining mechanical things to people who were genuinely curious rather than just politely interested. Chloe stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene with the assessing look she'd had since she was 6. "You're here a lot," she said to Vanessa. Not as an accusation, as a data point. "Is that okay?" Vanessa asked. Chloe considered this with the gravity of a 10-year-old who understood that some questions required real answers. "Are you going to try to fix the coffee machine?" she asked. Vanessa looked at the Mr. Coffee. "Should I?" "Dad's been fixing it for 15 years. I think he likes it broken," Chloe said. She set her backpack down and pulled her homework out with the efficiency of someone for whom this transition was automatic. "You can stay, but the table's mine until homework's done." "Understood," Vanessa said. Chloe sat at the workbench table with her notebook and her pencil and her characteristic focused silence, and Mason went back to the engine on the stand, and Vanessa leaned against the bench with her cold coffee and did something Mason hadn't seen her do in the weeks he'd known her. Nothing. She just stood there, in a cold garage in Brookhaven, not managing anything, not resolving anything, not running a meeting or taking a call or making a decision that affected 40,000 people. She stood there while a 10-year-old did long division and a mechanic diagnosed an engine noise, and the afternoon light came gray and low through the dirty windows. And she looked, for the first time since Mason had met her, like a person who had found a place where she didn't have to hold everything together simultaneously. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Some things, in his experience, were better met with the kind of quiet that lets them be what they are, rather than the kind of talking that turns them into something smaller. Outside, the road was empty. The gas station across the street was open. Somewhere on the property, a sparrow had taken up residence in the eave above the side door and was making the small, consistent sounds that sparrows make when they've decided a place suits them. Mason tightened the component in his hands and moved the flashlight. There it was. The thing the engine had been trying to tell him, visible now in the way that things become visible when you've been patient enough and honest enough to keep looking past the wrong assumptions. He picked up his marker and wrote the finding on the yellow legal pad. He wrote it in his handwriting, large, angled, more fast than neat, and it was accurate and it was enough. And the day continued the way days continue when the work is real and the people in the room are present and nobody is pretending that any of it is more than what it is. Which, it turned out, was more than enough. It had always been more than enough. The Monday mornings had just been hiding it,